Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics, where we celebrate the breadth and the depth of the comics medium. Usually we do this through reviews, overviews, edition comparisons, publication history studies, and other geeky things like that. Currently, however, we're in the midst of a viewer-requested tour of our complete comics collection, a multi-shelf and therefore multi-episode series. We've covered 6 shelves so far, and the 6 videos for those can be found in this handy-dandy playlist linked above. To that, today we're adding the massive shelf 7. Massive not because it's a huge shelf, although it is larger than some of the shelves that we've covered before, but because it contains so many thin hardcovers and paperbacks that we end up with a number of books on this shelf. And there aren't that many continuing series. Most of these books are standalone reads and therefore deserve some individual attention. I'm guessing it's going to take me a while to get through this. This shelf contains a lot of indie comics from publishers like Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly, NBM, and others, and also contains all my Tintin as well as most of my European comics, or bande dessinée if you prefer. I'm anticipating not just taking a long time with the books on this shelf, but also a number of mispronunciations of people's names in foreign languages, so I apologize in advance. I also apologize for the nasality and occasional sniffle due to my current cold. Having gotten to the end of this preamble, let us finally jump into shelf 7. First up on the shelf is Razzle by Jeff Smith. Razzle is Jeff Smith's grown-up adult follow-up to Bone, his all-ages classic. I enjoyed Razzle quite a lot. It was originally published in comic book form, but these trade paperbacks are oversized and perfect for this noir sci-fi story, which blends together the Tesla-Edison rivalry with parallel dimensions. I have a couple of those single issues, but I think these oversized collected editions are really the best way to read this book. Speaking of oversized editions, this is Stephen Collins's The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil. This is the Jonathan Cape edition, which is a much larger format than the Drawn and Quarterly, I think, version, which has a nicer, creamier cover, but is smaller than this. I love this book. I love the fairy tale, fable-like quality of the story, as well as the seeming silliness but weight it has, but in particular for this lovely pencil art. This is New School by Dash Shaw, published by Fantagraphics. My first book by Dash Shaw, which impressed me a lot and got me searching for other books of his. These 2 volumes are 2 volumes of an anthology of graphic fiction published by the Yale University Press, edited by Ivan Brunetti. This is volume 1 with a cover by Seth. And this is volume 2 with a cover by Daniel Clowes. This anthology of graphic fiction cartoons and true stories is a wonderful sampler of modern indie American comics, similar in a lot of its intersection with the best American comics that were also published around this time. Someone who featured in the best American comics and features in these anthologies a lot is Adrian Tomine, and this is the hardcover edition of his New York drawings, a decade of covers, comics, illustrations from the New Yorker and beyond. Art in Time, Unknown Comic Book Adventures 1940 to 1980 by Dan Nadell is actually the second Dan Nadell book that I have purchased. It's a collection of lost and forgotten comics that's quite fascinating. There's another volume, Art Out of Time, which I own, but I don't know where it's gotten to. This is Street View by Pascal Rabate, a wordless play. It's an accordion book, sort of difficult to show over here, but folds out, showing the same street scene at different times in the mornings. And if you turn it around and read it this way, scenes of the same apartment building in the evenings. Similar in many ways to what Chris Ware did with Building Stories and what Richard Maguire did with here, but far less talked about. I think this is a wonderful book. Duncan the Wonder Dog is an experimental but mind-blowing comic. Very difficult to describe, but quite fascinating. I think this is supposed to be part of a series because it says show 1 on the cover, but I have never seen any follow-up to this, which is a real pity. This book over here is The Great War by Joe Sacco, another accordion book that folds out. It comes in this slipcase, and I'm not going to take this out, but it is Joe Sacco's look at a single day, July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. As the book unfolds, it tells you from morning till evening about that one day. A really fantastic experiment, highly recommended to fans of Joe Sacco and World War I history. I'd like to be able to place this back in like this, but it just sticks out so much, and there's a gap over here, which is why I keep it like that. From NBM Graphic Novels, Glenn Gould, A Life of Tempo, a really wonderful biography of a musician I did not know a lot about. Eleanor Davis's How to Be Happy from Fantagraphics books. Hubert, and a couple of books by Bryan Talbot. The Tale of One Bad Rat, which was the first Bryan Talbot book I read and impressed me quite a lot, which I followed up with Alice in Sunderland and Entertainment, which is a biography of Lewis Carroll mixed in with the history of the city or the town of Sunderland, with Alice in Wonderland and many other things folding in and out of it in a way that I found completely mind-blowing. I've read a number of Bryan Talbot books by now, but this remains one of the most impressive comics work by him that I know of. Then we have 3 new additions to my collection by Geof Darrow. I'd heard a lot about Shaolin Cowboy, so I picked up Shemp Buffet. And the crazy detailing and the violence and the line work was so good that I had to get Who'll Stop the Rain, which is the 2nd volume from Dark Horse, as well as Hard Boiled by Frank Miller and Geof Darrow, which I think was Geof Darrow's introduction to the world, but I hadn't read it until I saw what Geof Darrow does with the art. I'm not a big fan of Hard Boiled, but it's hard to deny how impressive the artwork is. Continuing the little Dark Horse streak over here is Moby Dick by Chabouté. I'm a recent convert to Chabouté. I picked up Park Bench, which I really enjoyed, and since then I've gotten Alone and Moby Dick, all of which are extremely impressive in their composition, their use of black and white, the details that Chabouté is able to bring to this story. In the space of 3 months and 3 books, Chabouté has become one of my current favorites. I'd heard a lot about Finder by Carla Speed McNeil, but I haven't gotten my hands on the omnibuses. I found a cheap copy of Talisman, which I checked with a friend who assured me that I could read it out of order, and I really enjoyed it. It's about storytelling and narratives, and also introduces the world of Finder in a way that I thought worked very well for me. Now I'm really interested in finding any volume of Finder that I can. In the midst of these Dark Horse books is an old Image Comics volume, The Complete Classic Adventures of Zorro by Alex Toth. If you're not familiar with Alex Toth's Zorro work, this is a must pick up. Classic stuff that, while not part of the groundbreaking Alex Toth work that people talk of, is still very influential and very cool to read even today. I think I have it in here because it was a little bent when it arrived, and I've had it between 2 hardcovers ever since, trying to straighten it out. Beasts of Burden by Evan Dorkin and Jill Thompson. Terrific supernatural series starring dogs and cats. At the end over here we have some Charles Burns, so a used hardcover copy of Skin Deep, and then The Hive, which is actually part 2. X'd Out is the first book. I haven't gotten around to the 3rd book. These books are extremely interesting, but they just creep me out in a way that I'm not sure if I'm enjoying myself, so I haven't made up my mind whether I'm going to get the 3rd volume or not. I don't find myself returning to X'd Out or The Hive these days, so I'm wondering about the 3rd volume. In all honesty, I'm probably going to get it. There's just been a couple of other things to pick up before. And right at the end is Posey Simmons' Tamara Drew, which was originally published, I think, in The Guardian and then collected together in this volume. I read somewhere that this is Posey Simmons' adaptation of Far From the Madding Crowd. I guess I can see that, but I think it works fine without you thinking about that. Moving down to the 2nd shelf, the first book over here is Soft City by Push Wagner. Soft City is called a lost graphic novel created in 1975 by Norwegian artist Push Wagner, and then the pages were lost until 2008 when it was republished in Europe. This is the American printing from the New York Review of Books with an introduction by Chris Ware. Then we have two very out there, for lack of a better phrase, comics published by Fantagraphics books, King of the Flies Volume 1 and Black Lung by Chris Ware. These are comics that, while I don't count as my favorites or beloved comics, have definitely played a very big part in expanding what I think of and challenged me to read different kinds of material and different approaches than what I might have been used to. Not as out there, but still bold and speculative, is Dalston Monsters from No Brow Press by Dilraj Mann, set in East London, featuring monsters and commenting very interestingly on immigration and gentrification, among other things. And I look forward to more from Dilraj Mann. Then we have three books that involve the husband-wife art team of Kerascoët, I think that's how that's pronounced. Satania, written by Fabian Vehlmann and illustrated by Kerascoët. A delirious fever dream that sort of mixes a journey to the center of the earth with spiritual themes. Terrific storytelling and art from Vehlmann and Kerascoët, who I originally became aware of because of Beautiful Darkness, which I read some years ago and was absolutely captivated and haunted by. This book is just fabulous. It's very creepy and takes the idea of a book like The Borrowers to some very dark levels. As beautiful as Satania is, Beautiful Darkness is, I think, a better book from the same team of Fabian Vehlmann and Kerascoët. And written and drawn by Kerascoët with coloring by Hubert is Beauty. Another beautiful and thought-provoking comic with no easy interpretations given. From NBM Comics Lit Publishing, Lulu Anew, a heartfelt slice-of-life story about a woman and a sudden decision that she makes. This is Flight of the Raven by Jean-Pierre Gebrat. This is a new printing by Eurocomics of an older comic. This World War II resistance story has spectacular art that makes this book worthwhile. Also from Eurocomics IDW, who published Flight of the Raven, comes the reason why I love them so much. Hugo Pratt's Corto Maltese, finally being published in handsome, glorious editions in English. I've heard a lot about Corto Maltese over the years, but apart from some very difficult and hard to find out-of-print titles, there didn't seem to be anything in English, which is why I'm so happy to see these volumes being brought out by Eurocomics IDW. What I really admire about Hugo Pratt's Corto Maltese is their absolutely modern flavor. It doesn't feel dated at all, primarily because Corto himself rejects things like nationalism and ideologies to take a much more unique and individual approach, which makes these stories quite refreshing and very different from some more Eurocentric stories of this time. The artwork is fantastic, and you can see its influence on everything from Modesty Blaise to Frank Miller. So far I have Beyond the Windy Isles, Under the Sign of Capricorn, In Siberia, The Ethiopian, Celtic Tales, and Fable of Venice. Then from Drawn and Quarterly, Igort's famous 5 is the Perfect Number, and then 3 books by Shaun Tan. There's Lost and Found, Tales from Outer Suburbia, and then of course The Arrival, which I consider one of my favorite comics of all time and also featured as part of my top 10 gateway comics. Actually, everything I've read by Shaun Tan is superb, and I know that he has a number of illustrated books and children's books that I also want to take a look at. Then we have 2 books from NBM by Cyril Pedrosa, Equinoxes and Portugal, both wonderful books, although my favorite Cyril Pedrosa is still 3 Shadows, which we saw on shelf 3. Peter Pan by Loisel, published by Soaring Penguin Press. This isn't for everyone, but I find this to be a very good take on Peter Pan, and I definitely prefer something like this to the rather candified Disney version. Over here we have a couple more books by Adrian Tomine, a first hardcover edition of Summer Blonde, and Scrapbook, which is uncollected work between 1990 and 2004. These are collections of stories originally published in Adrian Tomine's zine comics series Optic Nerve. From Archaea Press comes Jim Henson's Tale of Sand, which is based on a lost screenplay by Jim Henson, and then Ramon K. Perez has drawn this. This is a very unique comic. It's a hallucinatory dream more than an actual solid narrative, and it's very funny to think of someone like Jim Henson having written this. I don't think it's any surprise that this was never made into a movie, but it's definitely a comic book worth checking out. Then a couple of Robert Crumb hardcovers, the Book of Genesis, and a signed limited edition of My Troubles with Women. Here's another relatively recent acquisition, The Green Hand and Other Stories by Nicole Clavello, with an introduction by Daniel Klaus. The Green Hand is published by the New York Review of Comics and is another lost or underrated masterpiece of European comics being published for an American audience. I'm really glad that the New York Review of Comics brought this edition out. It was fantastic to get to know this artist I had no idea about. Then we have 4 books in the Love series. Love, the Lion, the Tiger, the Dinosaur, and the Fox. Gorgeous books. For when you can't afford the giant hardcover artists editions from IDW, you settle for the artisan edition, which is what I have here for Wally Wood's EC stories. If you're a fan of these artists and these stories, as I am of Wally Wood and EC Comics, this is a wonderful edition to have of that work. The most recent addition to this shelf is My Brain is Hanging Upside Down by David Heatley. I enjoy David Heatley. He's got a very unique, sketchy and cramped art style. This is my first book that's all by him. I've read him in The Best American and I think in McSweeney's 13. So I'm looking forward to reading this full book. And finally at the end over here, 7 Miles a Second from Fantagraphics books, as well as Songi of Paradise by Gary Panter. A masterpiece and not to be missed if you're a fan of Gary Panter's work. Regular or long-time viewers may be familiar with the third shelf on this shelf. For one, it contains all of my Tintin hardcovers, including the Casterman facsimile editions that I have a couple of videos on. And it is also a picture of this particular row of books that serves as the cover image for our YouTube channel. Looking at the Tintins, these are the black and white facsimile editions from Casterman. Tintin in the Congo is one of the editions that I haven't yet done a video on. And neither have I covered the Cigars of the Pharaoh or the Blue Lotus so far. I do have a detailed look at the Tintin in America facsimile edition though. These are all the black and white facsimile editions, and I have a couple of ones in color right at the end over here. King Ottokar's Scepter and the Black Island. A close look at this facsimile edition in comparison with the more modern edition is one of our earliest videos on this channel. In between these Casterman facsimile editions, we have the hardcover Egmont editions. In the cover image of this channel, they've been arranged by spine color, something that I saw in Glyn Dillon's book, The Now of Brown. And usually they are in chronological order, although they've been taken out for reading and making videos, and so currently are completely chaotically arranged. So in order to drive those people who like Tintins to be arranged chronologically absolutely crazy, let's take a quick look at this random order, which has the Blue Lotus, the Red Sea Sharks, Tintin and the Picoros, which I finally have in hardcover, the Calculus Affair, King Ottokar's Scepter, the Castafiore Emerald, the Shooting Star, Prisoners of the Sun and the 7 Crystal Balls, just a little out of order, Explorers on the Moon and Destination Moon, Tintin in Tibet, Land of Black Gold, The Black Island, Flight 714 to Sydney, The Secret of the Unicorn, followed by Red Rackham's Treasure, and The Crab with Golden Claws. After the Tintins, we have a couple of volumes of Crazy Cat, George Herman's newspaper strip that I am a big fan of, and these volumes by Fantagraphics, collecting them chronologically, are treasures of a classic. This is a kind, benevolent, and amiable brick. The volume is 1919 to 1921. At last, my dream of life has come true, 1922 to 1924. There is a happy land far, far away, 1925 to 1926. and Love Letters in Ancient Brick, 1927 to 1928. There are more volumes that I need to keep collecting in this chronological order, and I also have some Crazy Cat selected volumes like Tiger Tea, which is a long story, as well as a giant Sunday Press edition. Still, I'm hoping that the rest of these Fantagraphics volumes don't become incredibly hard to find before I've been able to complete my collection. Then we have volumes of Drawn and Quarterly, Volume 3, Volume 4, and Volume 5. These large paperback collections from Drawn and Quarterly introduced me to some of my favorite current creators, including Dupuy and Barbarian, who have a complete story in this volume that's also edited by Chris Ware and contains Frank King Gasoline Alley stories. More Dupuy and Barbarian and Rabagliati in Volume 5, and the entirety of the Adventures of Hergé, originally published in English in Volume 4. These 3 volumes have probably led me to more authors and more books and more publishers than any other magazine I can think of. I also spent an embarrassingly long period of time trying to find Volumes 1 and 2 until I realized that they were actually series of comic books. So there were 10 issues in Volume 1 and I think 6 issues in Volume 2. They weren't bound volumes like this. After Drawn and Quarterly, we get to some of my Tardi books. The Extraordinary Adventures of Adèle Blanc-Sec, Volume 1 and Volume 2, collecting multiple stories in each volume in English. Terrific stories with wonderful art, handsomely produced editions by Fantagraphics Books. Some more Jaques Tardi, The Arctic Marauder. I have a soft spot for it, but it's nowhere near as good as many of his other books, including the book that I put right at the top, The Bloody Streets of Paris, based on a Nestor Burma detective story by Leo Mallet. This remains one of my favorite comics. It's definitely my favorite Tardi, and I'm glad to see the Nestor Burma stories being reprinted by Fantagraphics. This is an old trade paperback edition that was never published in hardcover. This is a library binding edition that I was lucky enough to find. I'm really hoping that Fantagraphics reissues this book as part of their current Tardi series. From Jaques Tardi to Bryan Talbot and his wonderful anthropomorphic animal steampunk series Granville, featuring the adventures of Inspector LeBrock of Scotland Yard, who is a badger. These are Granville, Granville Mon Amour, Granville Bête Noire, Granville Noël, and the last book in the series, Granville Force Majeure. Please pardon my pronunciation. Another series of hardcovers over here, this time from Nobrow Press, Luke Pearson's excellent Hilda series. Volume 1 is Hilda and the Troll, originally published as Hilda Folk, followed by Hilda and the Midnight Giant, Hilda and the Bird Parade, Hilda and the Black Hound, and Hilda in the Stone Forest, which ends with a cliffhanger, and I'm really waiting to get my hands on the next book. This is a superb series that featured in my Best Comics for Kids video. And right at the end is Hasib and the Queen of Serpents, a retelling of one of the stories from the 1001 Nights by David B., the writer and artist of the excellent Epileptic. And this is a beautiful, dizzying, colorful work. The last book over here isn't really a comic. The Adventures of Tintin at Sea is a book about Tintin and all of the nautical themes and references found in the series. Just a wonderful companion book for a Tintin fan like myself. And the bottom shelf contains some of the tallest books in my collection, although not the tallest. First, we have the 6 volumes of Fantagraphics' archival reprinting of E.C. Cigar's Popeye, or Thimble Theatre. I love these old Popeye comics. They're a lot more mature than you'd think, and with characters like the Sea Hag and Jeep being such a big part of my childhood, it's fantastic to have the original series in such beautiful volumes, terrifically produced as always by Fantagraphics. This is a book from Indian publisher Tara Books, silkscreen printed by hand to preserve the traditional artwork styles. It's funny, this is the only book by Tara Books that I own, and I'd completely forgotten that they were the publisher until a commenter on this channel mentioned them and sparked the memory of this book. A big board book from Art Spiegelman, In the Shadow of No Towers, about dealing with the fallout of 9/11. And also by Art Spiegelman, the autobiographical Breakdowns. I have 2 copies of this, an older, more rundown version, and then a newer copy given to me by a friend. By Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly, we have It Was a Dark and Silly Night, which I mentioned in my Best Comics for Kids video, and the retrospective comics. Then a couple of books related to Love and Rockets. Love and Rockets, The Covers, a fantastic collection of some of my favorite covers in all of comics, and Jaime Hernandez, The Secrets of Life and Death, which I bought at Quimby's bookstore. In the Shelf 3 video, I talked a little bit about how Teddy Christiansen and Stephen T. Siegel are one of my favorite writer-artist combos who don't get enough credit, and The Red Diary is one of the prime examples of what they're capable of. This is a superb book. It's actually 2 stories in one with the same art but with different text, making for 2 very different stories. And to say more would really spoil a fantastic reading experience. Highly recommended. This is a special hardcover edition of March Book 1 by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. This is a famous autobiographical civil rights comic that has now been published in 3 books. I have the slipcase of Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3 in paperback, but I could never find Books 2 and 3 in this hardcover, larger format edition that I found Book 1 in. That's a pity, but I'm glad to have this one. I love March, and I strongly recommend checking it out. A very new addition to my collection, Matt Kindt and Tyler Jenkins' Grass Kings from Boom Comics. I really enjoyed this. I'm a big Matt Kindt fan, as I've said a couple of times before, and I'm always excited when he has a new series out. Then 2 slipcases of 2 volumes each of the Hip Hop Family Tree by Ed Piskor. This is an excellent series of books. I'm not very familiar with the history of hip-hop. I've obviously enjoyed a lot of the music, but this created a history and a sense of being there in a way that I've very rarely encountered in comics. Ed Piskor is now doing similar stuff with the X-Men universe and Grand Design. And if you like Grand Design but have never tried Hip Hop Family Tree, I strongly suggest you take a look. It's the same retro stylings and colors, making for a very unique experience. Another slipcase over here of the 3 hardcover volumes of Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie's Lost Girls. This is a bit of a controversial series because it's Alan Moore experimenting with pornography and seeing if it can be art. Obviously not for all tastes, but I consider it a beautiful book, and I consider this box set the best version of this book. And quickly, the last 3 things we have over here is a volume of Chris Ware's Acme Novelty Library, another Crazy Cat collection from George Herriman, The Cat Who Walked in Beauty, the panoramic dailies of 1920, and George Sprott's biographical account of a fictional character. That was a lot of books in a very short period of time. If there's anything you'd like a closer look at or you'd like me to get deeper into, leave me a comment below to let me know. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell to be updated as soon as my next video is up. Thank you as always for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.